Okay, welcome to part two of how architecture designers can increase their wages. Again, I'm John Williams with Fent Lakes Rendering House. Okay, so in part one, we talked about educating the public. Well, in part two, um, my bright idea to solve this problem is architecture designers, we need to carve out our niche of the industry. Okay, we need to, I'm speaking directly to architecture designers. There's architecture firms serve a purpose for architecture designers, but let's face it, at the end of the day, not every architecture designer is going to be an architect. Not every architecture designer want to be an architect. Not every architect want to be an architect. Many architects perform duties what would be ordinarily design work, and so this is this is the conundrum of the industry. And as architecture designers, what we need to do, we need to carve out our niche. Okay, our niche is we provide a fundamental service to the architecture firm. Without the architecture designer, the architecture firm process of mass production would just go belly up. Every architecture firm across the board could not keep up with the demand. And so the smart thing to do, instead of all this in-house fighting and all this separation of two powers, where you have the architect wanting to keep the architecture designer beneath him to suppress him in terms of a salary, in terms of room for advancement, we need to take our service out of the house, and we need to sell that service. Architecture designers, there needs to be a firm of architecture designers who will contract to architects the service that an architecture firm might need. And then that way, we're not into this kind of fantasy island, fantasy world belief system that one day we're going to advance up the pyramid chain, the food chain of job and responsibilities. Everyone knows how architecture firms work. The way that they work, if you don't know, is the ones that move up are the ones that's related to the owners, or the ones that's brown nosing. So you have architecture design designers or architecture design students who have been sold on the idea that they can aspire in the ranks up into a role that will give them a greater responsibility and a greater sense and fulfillment of executing those inner ambitions to design. It will never come to fruition, because you find out after working here for a number of years how burned out you get. I mean, over 20 years maybe, you might be able to design some type of awning, or they might give you a chunk of a building that you can work on. But the reality of it is that it's way too slow of a process, and I think that you're way too talented to sit and allow this to happen to you, and just to become mediocre and have your talent suppressed. So in this video, we're going to talk about, or we're actually talking about, how we can increase our wage. And the way that we can do that is if we decided that we want to take our service away from under the umbrella and then sell it back to the umbrella for a higher price, not the price that they want to pay us, because we know that they're using the idea that if you stick with us long enough, we'll allow you to advance up in the rankings, and that day may come 20 years later. And that's just the hard truth, the facts that most people who graduate from college, like I did, you were really aspiring to do. You wanted to be a part of a great firm. You wanted to be in there making design decisions and choices, and you never thought that it would amount to this. So in part 2, how to increase your wage as an architecture designer, this is my proposal. This is the solution. And again, there's a lot of litigation, a lot of legislation right now to where they are trying to make it clear to architecture designers what you can and what you cannot do. And they're using, just like government used the terrorist ploy, they're using safety as a concern. But we all know buildings that have been designed by architects that have fallen down and hurt people and seriously injured or killed people. So it's not a matter of whether or not an architecture designer is skilled enough, because most people in the public eye don't know, but I'm here to educate you today, is that architects, the undergrad training architecture designers and architects receive is the same. Okay, when architectural designer graduate undergrad and go into masters, usually the master program is something specific, like for example, it could be sustainable design, or it could be urban urban planning, okay, or it could be geothermal, okay. So it's something specific that they in school for 2 years to study, and then afterward they're required to work 3 years underneath an architect or architecture firm before they can actually take the test to become a licensed architect. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Well, if they're in college, like let's say we both graduated undergrad, so that's 5 years of training. All right, they go on to study the master's for 2 years. The undergrad student goes on to work for 2 years. Now, after the architect graduate master's, he has to work for architecture firm another 3 years under an architect. In the meantime, the architecture student will work 3 years. So he has 5 years of training by the time the architect student has 3 years. So when he has finished his 3 years and he's ready to take the test, the architecture designer would have 5 years working for an architecture firm, ideally. Okay, and it doesn't matter what test that the architect take in any state, because most of the questions on that test won't be about the master's program. It'd be about things that they learn in undergrad. There's a small chunk that's learned about stuff in the master's program. And when he's finished, when he become licensed, the reality is that out in the real world, you got very few clients that come in and ask for something specific. The biggest thing right now is sustainable design, but it doesn't take a licensed architect to execute sustainable design. So, are we on two equal platforms? Not really, but it depends on the experience of the architecture design student, because, like I said, the work experience, his body of work has already started. And the architect is yet to have proven himself as someone that has a great deal of body of work. And so the big idea about all this is, in order for architecture designers to improve prove their importance into the industry, we need to have our segment. We need to carve out our segment, carve out our niche, take our service, and then sell it back to these architects who practically benefit and reap the rewards from the grunt work that the architecture designer do, who's been marginalized because of the way that the law and the way that the old traditional folks have been doing things. So that's the thing that we need to do as architecture design students, is carve out our niche.